Picture this. You're 6 years old. Your fingers are still stained with ink from your first attempts at writing. Your feet dangle above the floor when you sit, and your world is just beginning to take shape in the glow of bedtime stories and candlelight shadows. But today you are not a child. Today you are Queen of England. It's November 1st, 1396. The ancient walls of St. Paul's Cathedral loom around you like the ribs of a stone giant. Candles flicker in their thousands, casting trembling halos of light across the faces of bishops, nobles, and diplomats, all watching, all waiting. The air is thick with incense and unspoken expectations. A great organ groans with solemn grandeur, its deep notes rolling through the cathedral like distant thunder. And at the center of this orchestration of power and pageantry walks a little girl, Isabel of France. Her golden gown is so heavy she can barely move. The crown perched on her head wobbles with every step. She doesn't smile. She doesn't look around. Her eyes are blank, like a doll carved from porcelain. She's beautiful, still, and silent. At the altar stands King Richard II of England, a man more than 2 decades her senior. He waits not with affection, but with calculation. Their marriage is not a union, it is a transaction, a fragile peace between 2 kingdoms locked in centuries of hatred, purchased with the innocence of a child. But to understand how this strange, silent coronation came to be, to grasp the gravity of what was lost that day, you must travel back to a France haunted by shadows, ruled not by kings, but by ghosts. Isabel was born into a palace where laughter had long since curdled into whispers. Her birthplace, the Louvre, then a fortress of royal authority, was filled not with joy, but with dread. Why was her father, Charles VI of France, known forever as Charles the Mad, had long since fallen into the black spiral of his mind? He would scream at invisible enemies. He tore off his clothes in winter, believing they were burning him. He forgot the faces of his own children. And most terrifying of all, he believed he was made of glass. Servants tiptoed around him, terrified he might shatter. They padded the walls, they forbade sudden movements. And the court, the heart of France, became a house of mirrors, where power flickered and faded like candlelight in a storm. While Charles spiraled into madness, another force rose in his place. Isabeau of Bavaria, Isabel's mother, a queen forged in cold calculation. She was beautiful but feared, intelligent but merciless. With her husband unfit to rule, Isabeau stepped into the void, but not as a guardian, as a manipulator, a schemer. Chroniclers called her dissolute, depraved, dangerous. She surrounded herself with lovers, played nobles against one another like cards, and began selling off her daughters like prized possessions. To her, Isabel wasn't a girl. She was a peace treaty in a silk dress. By the time Isabel turned 6, France was crumbling under the weight of its own ambition. The 100 Years' War had already torn deep scars across both French and English soil. Villages were burned to ash, peasants starved, the rivers ran red with 1,000 forgotten names. And now, with Charles VI unfit and France in chaos, the kingdom needed breathing room. Isabeau's solution: marry her youngest daughter to England's king, a king who had already buried his first queen, a king growing increasingly unstable. Richard II was no monster, but he was no hero either. His reign had begun in brilliance and promise, but by the time he stood waiting at the altar for little Isabel, he was already unraveling. Distrustful, isolated, obsessed with legacy and divine right. The whispers in his court grew louder. Traitor, tyrant, childless king. He needed an heir, or at least the illusion of a future. So the match was made. Isabel was dressed in gold, placed on a ship and sent to a foreign land where no one spoke her language and every gesture hid a threat. When she arrived, the people of England were confused, some horrified. A queen who still needed help tying her shoes. But the wedding went forward. because kingdoms do not weep for little girls. They consume them. The ceremony was long, cold, and brilliant. The archbishop droned ancient Latin blessings. Nobles feigned smiles, and as Richard took her tiny hand, the walls of the cathedral seemed to groan beneath the weight of something older than stone. Generations of children sacrificed for power, their names lost, their stories untold. Isabel would never be a child again. She would never know laughter without suspicion or dreams without consequence. She was crowned, paraded, and placed in the care of Richard's household, but she was not treated cruelly. Not yet. Richard reportedly showed her kindness, gifts, even affection in his own way. He knew she was too young for consummation. He said he would wait until she was of age. But that doesn't cleanse the stain, because kindness in captivity is still captivity. And Isabel, though a queen in name, lived like a ghost behind palace walls. Her days were dictated by tutors, nurses, and ceremonies she did not understand. She was a stranger in her own story, her future already carved by hands she had never touched. And outside those palace walls, the storm was building. Richard's grip on the throne was weakening. His arrogance alienated the lords. His policies infuriated the commons. And soon Henry Bolingbroke, his cousin, his rival, returned from exile with an army at his back and vengeance in his heart. The fragile world that had been built on Isabel's shoulders shattered. In 1399, just 3 years after the wedding, Richard was captured, deposed, and imprisoned. He would never see freedom again. Some say he died of starvation. Others whisper he was murdered with chilling efficiency. But however it happened, the throne changed hands, and Isabel, at just 9 years old, was now a widow in a foreign land. Her husband dead, her title stripped, her fate once again dangling in the hands of strangers. She begged to return to France. She wrote letters. She wept, but England refused. King Henry IV, now ruler, saw Isabel not as a child, not even as a queen, but as a political pawn still useful. He tried to marry her to his own son. She refused, again and again. A child with no army, no power, no family beside her. Refused. There's a strange kind of courage in that. After months of negotiation, she was finally allowed to return home, but even then, she was a prize. She was handed over at Calais like a returned package, her name carved into treaties and scrolls. She returned to a France still poisoned by madness and war. Her mother, Isabel, had moved on to other schemes. Her siblings had scattered. Isabel herself, still barely into her teens, was married again, this time to her cousin Charles, Duke of Orleans. He was only 11. Their marriage was nominal, cold, distant. But this time, she would not live long enough to see it bear fruit. Isabel of France, Queen of England, forgotten daughter of madness and ambition, died at the age of 19. No children, no legacy, no monuments. Just a whisper in history, one of many girls dressed in gold and silence, swallowed by the machinery of power. She was laid to rest in Blois, far from the thrones that had claimed her youth, far from the cathedrals that had crowned her and the palaces that had silenced her. No grand funeral procession marked her passing. No armies mourned. Just a few lines in the chronicles of men too distracted by war to care that another queen had vanished before she became a woman. And yet, if you listen closely, you can still hear her footsteps echo in the stone corridors of power, where little girls are still dressed as queens, where innocence is still a currency, and where history forgets those who were used and discarded. But Isabel's tale is not unique. Her story is just one stitch in a vast, blood-soaked tapestry woven from the bones of countless others. For in the Middle Ages, royalty was not about privilege. It was about survival, and the women caught in its orbit were rarely the ones telling the story. Most were silent. Some were silenced. but all of them, every child bride, every ghost queen, every forgotten princess, carried the weight of dynasties on shoulders barely grown. Oh, lo, the freedom that grew from our effort to become a phobia, and to gain. Its presence plagues them, until there is no commitment to healing and openness to the light that it left. To understand the depth of this darkness, we must shift our gaze now not just to queens and crowns, but to the minds of monarchs. For as Isabel's father slipped into madness, as Richard II's paranoia consumed him, another world was unfolding, one even more terrifying, a world where the line between sanity and power was paper-thin, where kings were believed to be chosen by God, even when they clawed at their own flesh or drowned themselves in bloodletting rituals to rid their bodies of demons. This was not metaphor. This was medicine. In the twilight of the 14th century, the human mind was a mystery feared more than understood. And those who suffered, be they kings or commoners, were rarely treated with compassion. Instead, they were bound, bled, burned, or exorcised. Mental illness wasn't seen as a condition. It was seen as possession. Madness was a judgment, a punishment, a curse. And in a world ruled by divine right, a mad king was more than a tragedy. He was a threat to the entire order. When Charles VI believed he was made of glass, physicians didn't try to reason with him. They prescribed ice baths, leeches, and the burning of herbs beneath his bed to drive out evil spirits. When he attacked his own men in a psychotic frenzy during a parade, killing several with his sword, it wasn't labeled a mental break. It was interpreted as divine wrath. His episodes came without warning, stretching for months, then vanishing like smoke. And while he wandered the halls of the Louvre, talking to himself in a voice not his own, France was slowly tearing itself apart. The Regency Council, a venomous nest of dukes and uncles and cousins, began feeding on the king's vulnerability. They played politics with lives, betrayed alliances, and ignited feuds that would plunge the nation into decades of civil war. And amidst it all, the Queen, Isabel, emerged not as a protector, but a player. With her husband incapacitated, she signed treaties, arranged marriages, and brokered secret pacts with England. Many saw her as a traitor, a woman who sold her daughter to a foreign crown, who paraded lovers through royal apartments, who let France bleed while she tightened her grip on its veins. But pause here. Look deeper. Was she truly a villain? Or was she, too, a victim of the same brutal machine that devoured Isabel, in a world that offered women only two paths, obedience or manipulation? Isabel chose the latter, and while history would carve her name in acid, one truth remains unshakable. The game was never fair. Not for queens, not for kings, not for anyone. Consider now the royal children. The daughters and sons born not for love, but for leverage. Their cradles were gilded, but their lives were not their own. As soon as they could walk, they were betrothed. As soon as they could write, they were instructed in diplomacy, not dreams. A daughter might be married off before she ever knew the sound of her own voice. A son might be sent to war before he learned to read. Childhood was a luxury reserved for peasants. As he read, the son felt himself to imagine, for the royals, it was theater. Take Margaret of Valois, a French princess married to a man who despised her. She was locked in a room during her wedding feast as a massacre unfolded in the streets of Paris. Take Catherine de' Medici, who ruled France through her sons, but was blamed for every death, every shadow, every dagger in the dark. Take Juana of Castile, once beautiful, once brilliant, later imprisoned for 46 years, declared mad by men who feared her mind. And take Isabella of France, not our child queen, but another, wife of Edward II of England, who watched her husband abandon her for male favorites, who raised an army, deposed him, and became known as the she-wolf of France. Each of these women wore a crown, but each bore a curse. The curse of being born into power with no control over it. The curse of being history's scapegoat, its silent witness, its misunderstood villain. But perhaps the most chilling truth is this: the stories we remember are only the tip of the blade. Beneath every grand chronicle, every royal lineage, every gilded portrait lies a cemetery of forgotten lives. Girls wed in secret, children buried without names, queens erased from records because their madness made them inconvenient. There are rumors, stories passed down in corners of dusty monasteries, that some royal daughters simply vanished, sent away to remote abbeys, hidden in towers, declared dead when they were simply inconvenient. And then there were the ritual purifications, the bloodletting, the fasting, the sleep deprivation, the exorcisms, all inflicted on children too young to understand why. One account speaks of a 7-year-old duchess locked in a cellar for days while monks chanted to cleanse her of unholy urges. Another tells of a 10-year-old bride who fainted at her wedding, only to be revived with wine, her body dressed and arranged like a puppet so the ceremony could continue. These are not fairy tales. These are facts. Ugly, buried, and trembling beneath the weight of centuries of sanitized history. And what of the physicians? The court doctors who swore oaths to heal, yet practiced medicine soaked in superstition and cruelty. They believed that a woman's wound could wander around her body, causing hysteria, that bleeding a patient would balance their humors, that certain herbs, often poisonous, could purge a soul of evil. And the treatments administered to queens were no kinder than those inflicted on paupers. One queen, ravaged by grief, was locked in a room filled with burning herbs until she collapsed in delirium. Another was forced to ingest mercury for her melancholia, only to lose her teeth, her memory, and eventually her life. And yet they endured, not because they were strong, but because they had no choice. Because to be royal was not to be privileged, it was to be possessed. Your body, your mind, your very soul belonged to the state, and if you broke under that weight, no one wept for you. They replaced you. And still, the machine rolled on. The pageants, the weddings, the treaties, the silk and gold stitched over bleeding skin, because to admit the truth, that beneath the velvet robes were frightened children, broken minds, and shattered spirits, was to admit that the entire system was built not on glory, but on sacrifice, the quiet, lifelong sacrifice of those history calls queens, but never allowed to be human. They called them divine, God-chosen, anointed with sacred oil and wrapped in power. But behind the hollow crowns and ceremonial smiles, the truth was far more grotesque. Royalty wasn't sacred. It was a theater of blood, and those seated at the highest thrones often paid the greatest price. As the centuries unfolded, the myths grew richer, but the reality grew darker. Little changed. Children were still married before they understood what marriage meant. Queens were still groomed like sacrificial lambs, their lives measured not by love or legacy, but by the heirs they could produce. In every royal court, from England to the Ottoman Empire, from France to the Mughal throne, power was always parasitic, feeding on the minds, bodies, and lives of the vulnerable. But no system showed this more clearly than the royal rituals themselves, the pageantry that masked horror with holiness. Let us now return not to one specific queen, but to the ritual of royal purification, a ceremony practiced across medieval Europe when a noblewoman gave birth. Today, we might think of postpartum recovery as a time of rest and healing. But for a medieval queen, childbirth was a dangerous battlefield, and what followed was no comfort. It was confinement. Known as churching, the new mother was considered ritually impure after giving birth. She was hidden away for 40 days, quarantined not because of illness, but because the blood of childbirth was seen as spiritually contaminating. The child might be celebrated, but the mother, she was treated as a vessel, a necessary evil. Some were kept in dark rooms, forbidden from speaking to men or even touching sacred objects. And when she was finally allowed back into public life, she had to undergo a ritual purification, kneeling at the altar, not in celebration, but in apology for bringing life into the world, apology for bleeding, apology for existing in a body that did what it was designed to do. It's easy to look back and dismiss this as superstition, but imagine being that woman. Imagine bleeding for days, mourning a stillborn child, or struggling to nurse an infant while the world tells you your touch is unclean. Now imagine doing that again and again, because your value is tied not to your wisdom or courage, but to how many sons you can birth. And if your womb failed you, you were cursed, disgraced, cast aside, or worse, executed. Henry VIII of England had 6 wives, 2 were beheaded. All were victims of the same obsession, produce an heir or die trying. Anne Boleyn, intelligent and ambitious, was accused of adultery and incest, a fabricated trial masking one truth: she hadn't given him a son. Her final words before the axe fell were dignified, but she was only 35. She had once been the most powerful woman in England. She died branded a witch. But you don't have to go to kings and queens to see this horror play out. Even noble women and peasant girls suffered under customs that saw women as vessels, not people. In 15th century Germany, women accused of witchcraft were stripped naked, shaved, and examined for the devil's mark, a freckle or birthmark believed to be proof of a pact with Satan. Many were elderly widows, others were just different, too outspoken, too independent, too educated. One girl, just 16, was burned alive after a neighbor claimed she spoke to birds. Another, a midwife, was tortured until she confessed to causing a noblewoman's miscarriage, though records show the noblewoman had fallen from a horse. These were not isolated incidents, they were systemic. Entire towns purged their women in waves of fire and fear. The church blessed it, the kings allowed it, and the people watched. Even in palaces, no one was truly safe. Take the bizarre case of Joanna of Naples, a queen whose beauty and ambition threatened the patriarchs around her. She was accused of murdering her husband and strangling political rivals. Whether these stories were true or not is almost irrelevant. Her name was dragged through the filth of rumor until her enemies finally caught her. She was smothered with a pillow in her own bedchamber. Her body was buried in an unmarked grave. Justice never followed. Only silence. Or consider Empress Elizabeth of Austria, Sisi, a woman worshipped for her beauty but broken by her role. Obsessed with maintaining her thinness, she ate almost nothing, binding her waist so tightly she sometimes fainted during court appearances. She was trapped in a gilded cage, tormented by a mother-in-law who controlled her every move, and shattered by the suicide of her son. In her final years, she wandered Europe in mourning clothes, avoiding cameras and people, haunted by the ghost of her past. When she was finally stabbed to death by an anarchist, she begged her attendants not to tell anyone, quietly slipping